or expropriation, and how can we really do area-based conservation the right way, with the rights-based approach. So in order to really think about this, we as the young people of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network thought it is quite important to bring in key people from different stakeholders to really talk to us and to really understand how do we move towards conservation that can be done in the right way with a rights-based approach. And for this, we actually had a workshop that we conducted in Geneva during OAWG3, where we brought in over 24 different organizations with key stakeholders from women, indigenous people, local communities, and youth. And with them, we had conversations about, how do we really take area-based conservation forward. And some of the key things that we heard from that report. This was a joint workshop we did with UNESCO and GYBN. And some of the key things I want to mention from that report was that it was quite clearly highlighted that area-based conservation is an important tool for conservation, but they have to be done, it can only be effective when it is done without violating human rights. And these human rights violations have to always be taken into consideration, and we need to go beyond that. And to help achieve this, different implementation mechanisms need to be in order. We need to ensure inclusion of the right language in the indicators, in the language of the text as well. And we had a lot of brainstorming on exactly how this can happen, and we've created a report on this as well. But to really take this conversation forward, we wanted to have a press meet with key people from civil society, from the indigenous people and local communities, as well as youth, and some of the organizations supporting area-based conservation overall. So to start off our press meet today, I would like to first give the floor to Derek, who is from GYBN Uganda. He's a part of GYBN Africa, and we would like to hear from him on what he thinks is really needed with the current state of area-based conservation, given the violations we are seeing currently happening in Tanzania as well with the Masai Mara community.
Thank you very much. My name is Derek Mugisha from the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, Uganda. Continuous evictions of indigenous people and local communities continue happening in Africa. This is really happening already. Examples like the Maasai in Tanzania, where over 150,000 people will be evicted. But particularly, I'll give examples to where I come from in Uganda. We have the Batwa communities who were evicted from Bwindi impenetrable forest. Evicting people from the lands where they have protected for generations will not in any way support conservation. Conservation can still happen with them and still when they're in charge of their ancestral lands. And in fact, the outcomes for biodiversity and people are better when the rights are respected, the rights of indigenous people and local communities. As an African youth, I think evictions are not a solution. We need to do more to ensure recognition and respect for the rights of indigenous people, and respect for indigenous people and local communities, including their territories, to a free, prior and informed consent. The Post-2020 provides a key opportunity to advance this recognition for the best stewards of nature. The time to act is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. I will now move on to Helen from the Forest People Program.
Thank you very much. I wanted to start really by thanking the Global Youth Biodiversity Network for holding this really important press event, and also for the workshop that was held in Geneva that formed a really important moment to step into the negotiations that took place there. I wanted to recognise at the beginning of my comments today that the violence that we've heard of and seen in Loliondo is heartbreaking. Many of the members of Indigenous peoples' organisations and representatives who are here with us in Nairobi have brought those words and those voices into the negotiations, and I think that's extremely important. I wanted to refer back to a statement that the community members from Loliondo released this morning, because I think it's one of the best possible ways to step into the comments that I'd like to make today. So this is just very short, but part of the statement this morning was, with substantive and legal recognition of our traditional way of life and its contribution to the sustainability of the Serengeti ecosystem, we believe that our ancient autonomy can shine through in a fuller expression of Tanzanian nationhood. We seek to be recognised so that we can take a rightful place in our country. When we have power over our destiny, then our children and our environment and our future will flourish. So I wanted to start with those words because that is a call for action, but very specifically it's a call for equality, for equity and for justice. It's a call that prioritises inclusion and being part of the solution. So we're here at the moment to discuss and to advance the Global Biodiversity Framework, and this is a framework that itself must have space for communities and for peoples to not really act but to lead in the implementation of it. Part of that framework is obviously Target 3 in area-based conservation, which is the topic that this press meet today is looking at in more detail. And in this target, I'd like to raise two elements that will enable us to move closer to recognition of diverse and just conservation practice. So the first point that is important to understand in the context of Target 3 is that conservation is not solely the domain of big conservation organisations and government agencies and other private actors. Large landscape management and conservation has been done generationally by Indigenous peoples. The recognition of diverse conservation types and the recognition of the outcome of ancestral management of traditional territories is absolutely critical. There's opportunities for partnership, for provision of support, and for building alliances with Indigenous peoples and with communities to secure these sorts of diverse outcomes. But this requires that traditional territories have a place in Target 3. The second element that I wanted to just briefly touch on and then I'll close is really highlighted by the terrible events in Loliondo, and that is that conservation should never be the pretext for gross violations of human rights. It shouldn't be the pretext for any violations of human rights. And this means that there needs to be equity practiced in conservation by all actors. And what does equity mean in this context? It's a word that's thrown around a bit in conservation speak. In this context, it means participation, it means rights over resources, it means access to decision making, and it means justice. And this equity, this justice, needs to be secured across all forms of conservation action, including government-led and collaborative conservation management, and through supporting the radical expansion of areas that are recognised as being conserved by Indigenous peoples and by customary local communities. And I'll stop there to let others say. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Helen. I think that was a lot of food for thought that you provided us today. Thank you. I will now move on to Joseph, and we will have interpretation for him as well. So.
Merci beaucoup pour cette grande opportunité et ceux-là qui ont organisé cet événement. Je suis très ravi de pouvoir donner mon opinion sur cette question de la conservation des droits.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for organizing this event, and I'm happy to express myself on conservation and rights.
Ce qu'on doit savoir est que la conservation en Afrique, et surtout en Afrique centrale dans le bassin du Congo, a eu des effets négatifs sur la vie des peuples autochtones.
I would like to make us acknowledge that conservation, and especially in Central Africa, in the Congo Basin, had a negative impact on local communities.
La création, tout comme la gestion et la gouvernance des aires protégées, ont été faites sur base des violations et non prises en compte des droits des peuples autochtones.
The creation and the establishment of protected areas was made with violations of the rights of these local communities.
Des analyses que nous avons faites au niveau de la RDC avec EPRI, nous avons fait des états des lieux de peuples autochtones qui ont été victimes d'expropriation de terres parce qu'il y a la création. Nous avons le cas de Kaous Biega à l'est de la République démocratique du Congo, le cas de Salonga, Il y a d'autres cas en Afrique centrale qui ont chassé les peuples autochtones dans nos milieux traditionnels.
We ran many analyses in Central Africa on how this establishment of protected areas made local communities victims of expropriation in several cases.
Et cela pose trois questions que je veux voir. La question sur la justice et l'équité, et c'est le manque de contribution des peuples autochtones, parce que quand vous chassez les gens qui ont protégé la nature pendant longtemps et que vous les mettez dehors, donc vous manquez le bénéfice que vous pouvez capitaliser de par ces gens qui ont protégé la nature très longtemps.
So I want to ask 3 questions regarding to that. First of all, it's a question of justice and equity, and how this process is lowering the contribution and the participation of this local community, because when you expropriate them, you miss their contribution and the capitalization of their work for conservation.
Et des relations entre les peuples autochtones et les aires protégées sont tendues parce que réellement les responsabilités de conservation n'ont pas été partagées et inclusives.
So there is tensions in the relationship between local communities and indigenous people with protected areas because the responsibility was not shared and
n'ont pas été partagées. Donc.
Yes.
Et c'est là maintenant la question de se poser la question même pour la gouvernance de ces aires protégées actuellement. Quels sont vraiment leurs destins, leur avenir, si réellement les peuples autochtones ne font pas partie de la gouvernance et la gestion de ces aires protégées.
And it leads to the question on where does the management of these protected areas go, because these local communities and indigenous people are not participating in its management.
Maintenant qu'il y a une opportunité de cadre mondial post-2020, je vis dans les cibles 3 une possibilité de tenir compte des autres mesures efficaces de conservation, mais également des questions de droit et de justice.
So this post-2020 GBF is an opportunity to take into account the
prendre en compte réellement des autres mesures efficaces de conservation.
The other effective conservation measures, yes, sorry.
La question d'équité
and equity
et la justice.
and justice
Et le partage des responsabilités
and
pour la
sharing
biodiversité.
of responsibilities.
C'est
for
dans ce sens qu'on
biodiversity.
doit arriver réellement à lutter contre la perte de la biodiversité et le changement climatique.
That is the one true path for us to halt the loss of biodiversity and climate change.
Nous devons gagner des responsabilités, nous devons gagner des capacités, nous devons gagner des contributions des peuples autochtones pour atteindre les objectifs même de 30% au-delà de ce que nous avons.
We have to win inclusion, participation, responsibilities of indigenous people and local communities to really achieve the goals for the GBF.
Merci.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joseph. Now we will move on to Brian from the Campaign for Nature. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. My name is Brian O'Donnell. I'm the director of an organization called Campaign for Nature, and my organization has been a major advocate for Target 3, a global target to protect and conserve at least 30% of the world's lands and oceans. First, I wanted to say I agree with everything I've heard here and thought those were critical remarks. We must acknowledge that human rights violations have occurred in the past and are occurring today. Especially just as we've heard the horrific stories from Tanzania about the violations of rights against the Maasai, and I want to make in no uncertain terms that we condemn those the violence against the Maasai people. When we think about this, evictions of indigenous peoples from their territories is not conservation, it's crime. And we need to treat it like that. the future of conservation can only be successful if we work together to empower a rights-centered approach in which the people who have stewarded these places for millennia are not only protected from violations, but we have to think of it not in a defensive measure, we have to think of it as a leadership effort, that Indigenous peoples and local communities must be at the center of the leadership of conservation of biodiversity. Much of the world's remaining biodiversity is concentrated in Indigenous territories and stewarded by local communities, and it's through their leadership, through the recognition of their rights, through the security of their land and tenure, and their wisdom and traditional practices that we can succeed as a planet to safeguard biodiversity. So as we've heard from other speakers, this is the opportunity here in the designation of a new global biodiversity framework, that rights can be embedded into the text, into Target 3, into Target 1, and other targets as well. But it's not enough to embed the language in the targets, because we've seen in the past that can be great intention, but we must all also follow through and hold governments, NGOs, ourselves accountable to make sure that these rights are upheld, that the leadership is respected, and that we can have a new paradigm for conservation, one that centers the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, that we work in solidarity because we share this planet together. We need this approach to maintain the diversity of life on Earth, and that includes the cultural diversity of people as well. So I think we have a great opportunity here. I think the voices are starting to be heard. We're seeing some progress in some countries around the world, but there's too many that are falling behind. And we're seeing some progress here in these negotiations, but not enough yet. So I'll commit my organization to working in solidarity with you here to push for these rights to be embedded in the targets, and look forward to working with all of you to elevate this issue and make success here in Nairobi and then again in Montreal.
Thank you so much for that, Brian. It really shows a lot of solidarity to see how all of us are kind of synergizing in our messages and understanding, and a common pathway forward. So thank you so much for that message. I'll now move to Jennifer from IIFB.
Thank you very much. Well, the only reason I'm here is because I'm leading the IIFB on Target 3, but I have really nothing much to add what has already been said. However, the question is, how can area-based conservation be done right? And one of the things that is widely acknowledged in this forum is that there needs to be transformational change. There needs to be increased ambition. And that's why in Target 3, from the former 17% land, and it's now being proposed to have 30%. But my argument here is that ambition should not be only in the numerical aspect of the target. We have other elements of the target. We have equity, we have effectiveness, we have connectivity, we have integrity and integration into the larger landscape and seascape. And I would say that equity, which currently resides in the text, has not prevented what we have heard from happening. Therefore, equity needs to be more ambitious. We need to be more ambitious. If we look at the map, the only places where we can add more, majority of the spaces where we can add more areas that are protected, conserved, is in Indigenous territories. You can do that for all the countries all over the world, and you will see that the key biodiversity areas occur in Indigenous people's territories. What does this mean for equity and increased ambition on equity? It needs to be more explicit when talking about rights. There needs to be free, prior, and informed consent. There needs to be respect for Indigenous territories. And I would argue that it goes beyond Target 3, because we need Target 19, Target 18, for example, financial resources, resource mobilization. We also need Target 21, which talks about recognition of the rights, protection of the right to land, territories, and resources in accordance with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And maybe my last point is that Joseph comes from a community, all of the Indigenous peoples and local community members within the IIFB come from communities whose knowledge is deeply intertwined with their territories. Therefore, it's important for us to protect knowledge in order to protect biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Jennifer. It was very helpful for us to also see the overarching understanding of, the realities of what the 30% also means now. For the last speaker for our today, but definitely not the least, but also one of the most important voices for today, is we have Ramson, who's a Maasai, and he is also part of IIFB, and we would like to hear from him on how he's seeing this situation that is happening in Tanzania and what he thinks should be the way forward in his region.
Yeah, thank you so much. And being a Maasai and being an indigenous person, I think is that the case in Loliondo, if I may say, has opened up again the eyes of the world, and is showing people how area-based conservation is really becoming critical when people think about area-based conservation without thinking about the people who are living in those lands. For me, I would say that the Maasai people have been conservationists in nature, and they have been conserving the lands that they are occupying, just like any other person around the world. And this case of Loliondo, if I may say, is one case that we can say that the world is not respecting the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities who occupy those areas. And I think in this case, there is need to revisit this agenda and take keen interest when it comes to the indigenous peoples and local communities who have been protecting nature, protecting biodiversity. Biodiversity means a lot to the indigenous communities. They are not protecting it because it's just biodiversity. It's the source of their livelihood. And I think there is also need to really appreciate the knowledge that these people have who have been protecting nature for all the years. We're talking of the models that are coming. We may say it's parachute conservation, where someone goes to school and wants to practice this, removing people out of nature, separating people and the landscape they have been occupying. I'm talking in this because I've seen other models in other areas. Where I come from, we live with nature, we have wildlife in our territories, we have livestock, and these lands are being protected by integrating the scientific and the indigenous people's knowledge. That needs to be recognized. The other thing also that needs to be recognized is the indigenous people's territories. These people need to have the right of ownership of the land. I think that will block so many things when it comes to area-based conservation, because they will have the right to their lands and they will be included in everything that's being planned in terms of conservation. But without the ownership of the land, I think it will open more doors for them to be, for their rights to be violated. But I think the first right that needs to be done is to give the right of ownership, secure land tenure systems to indigenous peoples and local communities. That will be the first step of getting into protecting biodiversity.
Thank you so much, Ramson. I think with this we would come to an end with the panel discussion, the panel's first reflections, and we would love to hear any questions we have from the press, in person or online. Yes.
Okay. Oh, let me introduce myself. I'm Naftali Mwaura from Kenya, but working for Shino News Agency, Chinese news agency. I've been coming here a couple of times. I had a heads up towards this from ICLEI on what the youth are likely to talk about today. So I just wanted to know from the perspective of the youth, any member of the panel can answer me. Have your issues been factored in the negotiations that are going on? And are you optimistic? Maybe the final text on Sunday will capture your aspirations going forward, as far as biodiversity conservation is concerned. Because I've had someone mention about equity, inclusivity, intergenerational, or whatever. So please enlighten me on that.
Not yet to the level what we expect. We still miss rights and equity in there, because they're still doing the blah blah blah. They're still doing the same things I've been doing, putting with brackets and confusing everything. But we think it has to be clear. Rights and equity have to be inside. Unless we have those inside, we cannot guarantee that conservation will be safeguarded. So my thinking is Indigenous people and local communities have to be put first as we are thinking about conservation of biodiversity, because like my speaker on my right said, conservation means, actually it's not just about biodiversity to them, it's their source of livelihoods, it's their day-to-day kind of belief. This is where they have stayed for generations. It's their sense to a land. Unless you can guarantee that by this end of this week, and I'm sure now it's not yet guaranteed, it's not even seen anywhere, we are not even sure where this is going. So unless we are sure that this is guaranteed, that's when I'll even have hope. That's when I'll be optimistic over this. But unless it's not yet guaranteed, parties are still doing the same. They're still practicing what we did the other time, failing to achieve the targets around Indigenous people and local communities. So I can't say we are not yet there.
Just to add to it, I think for us it's very important that their rights are protected, because we know that a future in harmony with nature, the way we want it for our 2050 vision, can only happen with this. And for young people, it is a core priority as well. Yes. Any other questions?
Maybe before anyone else come in, I wanted to add something about about what he is asking. I think this is posing a threat to Indigenous peoples and local communities. When I think about the kind of discussions that are going on, I would not think of protecting the biodiversity or protecting our own lands as collective. I would think of subdividing my land and have my own title as a person, because I think that that's the time the land is more protected. But if the negotiation can include rights, secure collective rights of communities, I think it is going to support us in the work that we have been doing. But so far, there is no clear direction that we are moving, and it poses a lot of challenges to also how we think of protecting our own landscape and making them productive for the collective use of the communities that are occupying those landscapes.
They should have free, prior, and informed consent.
Thank you. I think here we learned a lot, Harry, and learning of the most important aspect you told us. What is the word that you decide to choose each one to include in the target 1, and target 3, each one.
Yes, both actually. Both target 1 and target 3 need to reflect explicitly the rights of Indigenous peoples from the point of view of the IIFB. And why do I say this? Because target 3 is about protection. Target 1 is about planning and about taking biodiversity values into consideration in planning. And all of the Indigenous peoples that I've encountered, including my community, have life plans. We have self-determined visions that need to be taken into account when the national governments are deciding how to use the different parts of the country, the lands. So I think it's important to have both. But one thing I wanted to add that I think I forgot to mention earlier is that these targets, sometimes they are divorced from the people who are actually going to do the protection, who are actually going to implement the spatial planning. And the people who are currently fighting really hard to protect these places are getting killed, they're getting criminalized, which is why it was very good for us to see yesterday that there was acceptance of protection of the rights of environmental human rights defenders in Target 21, and including access to justice. You have to look beyond just these dry words in the target and realize that there are people who are going to be doing this. Indigenous people, other human rights defenders, and therefore it's important to have that, if not in Target 1, Target 3. It has to be very strongly reflected in Target 21. Thank you.
It is hard to pick just one word. I think that these are legal documents, and so we need to make sure there's some legalese in there. Free, prior, and informed consent is important. Rights is important. Tenure security is important. So there's a lot. It's hard to pick one. So I wouldn't pick one in terms of just the language in the negotiations, because it's going to take some more than one word to really guarantee this. But if I pick one word to think about the attitude that we must have, it has to be leadership. It's a change of approach from one of just how do we not violate human rights to how do we center and respect the leadership of Indigenous peoples and local communities.
I think he's too blind.
Oui. Moi, je voulais ajouter seulement une réponse à première cible pour dire que ça fait appel déjà aux besoins de la sécurisation des territoires des peuples autochtones. Parce que la sécurisation des territoires des peuples autochtones est une valeur pour la conservation. Ça, c'est pour les cibles.
So for the target 1, I wanted to add that it's calling for securing the lands and the territories of the local communities.
Parce que en fait, c'est par rapport à cette contribution de connaissances traditionnelles dans la conservation pour le peuple autochtone que nous pouvons trouver plusieurs valeurs accessibles de la conservation.
Because it's through the traditional knowledge of these local communities that we can find the multiple values that they
pour la conservation.
For conservation.
Donc, s'il faut réellement tenir compte de ce qu'il a dit, donc on a besoin, et dans les cibles 1 et dans les cibles 3, de tenir compte des questions de droit. Et ça doit être clairement défini, indiqué dans les deux cibles.
So, for target 1 and target 3, we need to take into account the rights, and it has to be taken into account also in all of the targets.
Pour que quand il y a l'implémentation dans le pays, que ces dispositions des cadres global post-2020 puissent être appliquées dans les lois du pays.
So that when countries are implementing what is said in the GBF can be translated into national laws.
Merci.
This is just a very quick addition to the what's the one word question, and I would repeat again that one word's really tricky, but I would point to having words in different parts of the framework. So having justice in 21 is really important, having rights in 21 is really important, having 22 and women and girls is really important, free, prior and informed consent for target 3 is really important, and if we start to look at rights being embedded across the framework like that, then the only additional comment I wanted to make to what my colleagues have already said is in the framework and the preamble, the thing that overarches the whole framework, which at the moment is being called BBIS, but will become something else at some point, those principles and applying a human rights-based approach at that part and then replicating it through the goals and targets, I think for me is the most important way to understand how rights and equity and justice fit within the framework as a whole. Thanks.
Question?
Hi. Jennifer and Brian, you were here yesterday. My question is, what has changed in the past 24 hours? And I ask especially because we only have 2 to 3 days left, and I've been told that the CBD expects 80% of the text to be cleaned up before we go to Montreal. So how how much are your thoughts aligned to that, and how hopeful are you to have that achieved, especially when it comes to indigenous peoples and targets 21, target and target 11 and 13. Thank you.
Okay, yes. What has changed? Well, since we spoke, since we had the press conference, was it the other day?
Yeah.
The other day? Yesterday.
It all blends together.
Blending. The contact group has had a chance to tackle target 20 and 21. And that's the very first time that it was tackled. So that's a hopeful sign that finally time was allotted for these very important targets. Support for indigenous peoples has shown through in those two targets, as well as for human rights defenders, as I said earlier. Resource mobilization is yet to be tackled this afternoon, or this, right now. And as Brian said yesterday, this is something that will unlock the negotiations. We are seeing some countries who are not willing to go far forward on some of the targets because we have not yet resolved the issue of resource mobilization and how we bridge the financing gap for biodiversity. So there are signs of hope. We are moving now to smaller groups called the Friends of the Co-Leads, and these are supposed to be working fast. I think they're still warming up, so it's not really that fast. But I think now that all the positions have been laid on the table, it's now the basis for us to move a little bit faster in other targets.
Jennifer's kinder than I am. I sat through a panel or several panels today where they didn't really get into the discussions yet, and I don't think it's too early to know whether there are disagreements, because they're still talking about the most fundamental things, the definitions of, arguing over, should we call it seas or oceans, things that we should have done 3 years ago. We had this is open-ended working group 4. We were here in Nairobi several years ago with these beginning of these discussions where the definitions, that's the most fundamental thing, should be wrapped up years ago. And here we are coming together at great expense, people leaving their families and traveling, and nobody likes to get on a plane because they know that we're harming the planet with our carbon footprints. It pains me every time I get on a plane, so I want to make sure that it is really, really worth it. And when I sit in a room for hours to talk about a definition of something that should have been 2 years ago, it's painful. So maybe I don't want to be overly pessimistic because it's still the first few days, but they need to speed up. They need to get focused. They need to talk about the real substance, and we need to have convergence. So I'm not, it's early enough, I'm not pessimistic yet, but I'm a little bit nervous, let's put it that way. I think the blah, blah, blah comment might be, we don't want to keep the blah, blah, blah going, we can end the blah, blah, blah.
So could you quickly comment on your expectations of the percentage of, the cleaning job that you think can be done?
They're still adding text now. Oh, sorry. They're still adding text, more brackets, not reducing brackets. So we're creating more messes to clean. So ask tomorrow. I'm hoping we have a really good afternoon and a good day. But right now it's not 80% yet.
Bold prediction. Well, there are some. What I wanted to say was that the progress is uneven at this point. There are some contact groups that are doing better than others at clearing brackets, but there are some where the issues are just so contentious that we can't even get past the first line. So I don't know, I hope we get down to 50%.
So I think someone was actually clearing the text. So as young people, want to be very clear, most especially at target 21. We don't want to lose reference of the text, but we want it to come out clearly. The statement about youth, we are being removed from the text. This is really, really very important that we are watching you. Take this to the parties. We are really watching what you're doing. Don't lose the reference to youth. in the cleaning of the text. Let's reference to youth priorities and listen to us.
Do we have any more questions?
Hello everyone, and thank you for being here. Your comments are very valuable to us. My name is Mira Fernandez. I am the GYBN Policy Co-Coordinator together with CEPA. And I would like to ask a question to our panelists that have been following the target tree for the longest time, maybe. I don't know if it's Ellen, Brian, or Jennifer. We are very worried about having a target with a numerical value that doesn't have a strong components of human rights and the references to free, prior informed consent, the land tenurial rights, and the recognition of rights of indigenous peoples, other communities, women, youth. So we would like, I don't know, in our perspective, it could be counteractive even to have a numerical value if we don't have these references to human rights. And we wonder how could this even be remediated in the future, if it could, or if it would be better if we don't have these references to also not have a numerical value. Which are your perspectives on this? Thank you.
Well, very quickly, I think I touched on it already in my earlier intervention. Target 3 is not just about the numerical value. If we want ambition, we should strive to achieve it not just in the numerical aspect, but also in all the other aspects, most notably equity. So I agree completely with what you said. Just, it's always 30 by 30, 30 by 30, but maybe we should do enhanced ambition on equity as well.
Yeah, I think I agree with Jennifer. I think in order for 30 by 30 to be effective, the rights language is fundamental. And so they go part and parcel. We've made that clear in our comments and our advocacy to the CBD. We've asked parties to include it. We've seen some of it now in brackets, some language that needs to be, actually the whole target is in brackets, including the percentage. So all of this is up for discussion, but I think that as these things get resolved, we need ambition for the amount of area, we need ambition for the amount of rights, we need ambition for the effectiveness of these areas, the connectivity of them, how we're measuring it. So I agree with the premise of your question that these are not pieces that you can separate. I mean, one of the nicest things of someone who works on 30 by 30 is it's small, you can put it on Twitter, it's an easy to communicate slogan, but one of the dangers of an easy to communicate slogan is all of the accompanying bullets don't get communicated as well. And so we do have to ensure that when we talk about 30 by 30, we also talk about rights, we talk about effectiveness. So I think the premise of your question I fully agree with, and with what Jennifer said.
If we don't have any more questions, we could wrap up today's press conference. Maybe I would like to firstly thank all the panelists who are with us today, who took out their precious time while resource mobilization is being discussed to come and talk to us. We really appreciate the fact that you're here today with us. Like Ramsan mentioned, I am also one of those conservationists who was educated in the way Ramsan mentioned it, where we were taught that nature and people are supposed to be separate. We are shown in India how these relocations are done and how you should do it in the right way, but they never tell you that people and nature can be together and they can live together. And this is something that I am unlearning and relearning through my process of being with the CBD and how really we should look at conservation. And I think conversations like this, the fact that you all were here to create this intergenerational dialogue with us is a great sign, because it helps us learn better and really understand how we can also communicate this and understand what is the pathway forward and really answer that question, how do we do conservation right? So, I think you guys really touched upon some critical things for us to think about and really helped us clarify things as young people. So I really appreciate all the time and effort and knowledge sharing that you did with us today. So thank you so much for that. And just before we end, I would love to just read a short sentence from Sefa's her very popular article on human rights-based approach in addressing biodiversity loss. So her last para, which I love very much, says, and is a great conclusion for today's talk as well, is a rights-based approach is not an add-on. It is a non-negotiable element that must be clearly stated throughout the text of the GBF. Not only is it a moral and legal obligation, which should be reason enough, but it is also the most effective way to conserve biodiversity. Protecting human rights produces real biodiversity outcomes. Although we say this from lived experience, it is not just us saying it, so does the science. And this is her words, and I hope we can end today's press conference with that. So thank you so much, everybody. Maybe we can take a quick photo. Yes. All the yeah. Or we can put them out. Just in the front. With all, because they're all. Yeah. She was reading